Hope you have a Bible tonight. I want to encourage you to take it to Revelation chapter 1. We're going to continue in a lesson, a two-part lesson that we started last Sunday night in trying to see Jesus in Revelation. Some of you may remember the late W.B. West. He wrote a book on Revelation and is considered one of the best from those of our brotherhood. And he used to say, the only way to study and understand Revelation is to put on your first century glasses. What he meant by that is you'll never understand Revelation unless you study it in light of the first century world, that culture, and of course the church that existed at the time. So having noted that, I think there are several things we ought to remember as we approach trying to see Jesus in Revelation. We should remember a few things about that world specifically that will help us better see Jesus and understand Him the way we should. The first thing you need to remember is that this was a world that was controlled by the massive Roman Empire. This was the world that they lived in at that time. Rome ruled the world. And by the time this book was written, there's a little bit of controversy on exactly when this book could have been written. Some believe it might have been in the 60s before the destruction of the temple, AD 70. Most, though, believe it was a little later, maybe around the 80s, 90s. And by that moment in time, a man by the name of Domitian was the Roman emperor. And the unique thing about Domitian, he kind of upped his game, so to speak, beyond all the other Roman emperors, although some of them had persecuted Christianity. Domitian got to the point where he actually demanded that you worship him as a god. He demanded that you worship him as a god. If you were a part of that area and you lived in the Roman Empire, you were required to do that. Ironically, there was one group of people exempt from worshiping Domitian. And I didn't know this until recently, but that one group that was exempt from worshiping the emperor was actually the Jews. Rome respected the fact that the Jewish people were monotheistic, and they recognized that their God was said to be the one God of heaven and earth. And so as a result, they gave them a pass. And when it came to worshiping the emperor, the Roman emperor, Domitian gave the Jews a pass. And I think if you think about it for just a moment, that shines a little light into maybe why it would have been tempting if you were a Christian and had been a Jew to maybe all of a sudden decide, I think I'll be a Jew again. You can see the draw back to Judaism just through that alone. Well, the church was not so lucky like the Jews. Christians were literally forced to make a decision. They either had to worship the emperor or they had to confess Jesus and die. That's really what it had come down to for them. This was the beginning of a war that Rome would fight with Christianity for the better part of 300 or so years. This is the world that the people lived in that received this original letter. So I think seeing Revelation in light of this helps us understand what those people in those days were really having to deal with. And it helps us better understand what this letter must have meant to them. I mentioned last week as we introduced this lesson, I mentioned that there's a lot of speculation about Revelation, and you can really get quite lost in getting into the weeds, if you will, of trying to figure out a lot of the things that are dealt with in Revelation. But I mentioned, though, the one thing that I don't want us to do is I don't want us to fail to see the most obvious thing in Revelation, and that is Jesus. And so this is why this lesson is about Jesus in Revelation. Last week we talked about these four things. We talked about how, first of all, that Jesus is revealed in Revelation. The very first Greek word in this book is apocalypsis. And while most people think that the idea of an apocalypse refers to chaos and confusion and maybe uncertainty. The actual meaning of that word is right the opposite. That word actually means is this is an unveiling. This is an uncovering. In other words, this is said to be the apocalypse of Jesus Christ. So this is the uncovering or the unveiling of Jesus. The very first statement in this book reminds us that this is a book that shows us Jesus. And while I think a lot of us probably are a little surprised at that because we kind of look at Revelation as a book that maybe we don't understand quite as well, but it was meant to be a book to show us Jesus. Jesus is revealed in Revelation. We talked about how Jesus is a blessing in Revelation. Verse 3 of Revelation chapter 1 says that those who read this letter will be blessed. And I mentioned to you that the idea here from the original language is that those who hear this letter read aloud would be blessed. We talked a little bit about why it was possible for them to hear this letter read in their era, in their culture, and maybe understand some of the terminology because they were used to people communicating like that more so than we are today. But no doubt, though, reading this letter reminds us that Jesus is a blessing to us. Jesus, we said, is also praised and exalted in Revelation. If you look in verses 6, 7, and 8, this is the dedication statement to Jesus. The book is written about Him. This book is written in dedication to Jesus Christ. And because He's the Alpha and the Omega, He should be praised and He should be exalted. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in this lesson as well. And then we also said that Jesus is concerned and He's in control. This book shows us that Jesus knew what was going on. Jesus was concerned about what was going on, especially with His own people during that time. And we're going to have a little bit more to say about that as well. Those are the 4 things we talked about last week. Now, we have 4 other things to add to that here in the next few minutes. So let's begin by, I guess you would say, number 5 in this list of seeing Jesus in Revelation is Jesus is glorified and worshiped in Revelation. Jesus is glorified and worshiped. We said just a moment ago He's exalted and He's praised. And so therefore, in the book of Revelation, you're going to see language and you're going to see imagery about how Jesus is worthy of our worship. You might recall over in, I think it's chapter 19 or so, John is receiving this revelation from the angel, and at some point or another, John, remember, bows down to the angel, and what does the angel say? Get up. Don't worship me. And the emphasis really in that and in many other places in Revelation is this idea that Jesus alone is worthy of our worship. In the beginning of the book, chapter 1 and verse 6, you start seeing how He is worthy to have glory and dominion forever and ever. But turn over to chapter 4. We're going to skip over chapters 2 and 3 right now. We'll come back to those a little bit later. But in chapter 4 and chapter 5, you can really see the emphasis on how Jesus should be worshiped in Revelation. Look at verses 9 through 11 in chapter 4. It says, "Whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to Him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before Him who sits on the throne and worship Him who lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, 'You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for You created all things, and by Your will they exist, and they were created.'" And so you can see how Jesus in chapter 4, He is worshiped in Revelation because He is the Creator. He is overall. He is the reason everything that exists. If you go over to chapter 5, look at verse 11 and following. Chapter 5, it says, "Then I looked," verse 11, "and I heard the voice of many angels around the throne and the living creatures and the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, 'Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessings.'" And every creature which is in heaven and on the earth and under the sea and such as are in the sea and all that are in them, I heard saying, blessing and honor and glory and power be to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb forever and ever. And then it says the 4 living creatures said, Amen. And the 24 elders fell down and worshiped him who lives and is forever. The idea that Jesus, the Lamb, is receiving worship just like God receives worship is a reminder that Jesus is seen to be worshiped in the book of Revelation. Some of these quotations in chapter 5 especially are from songs, and they clearly reveal that Christ is worthy of our worship. So this is one of the things we're reminded in the book of Revelation about Jesus. He's seen to be one who should be worshiped. But Jesus is also seen in Revelation as one who is watching the church. Jesus is watching the church. Now, I said last week that Jesus is concerned and he's in control. But one of the more interesting parts of this book occurs in chapters 2 and 3. It may be the part of Revelation that we're actually the most familiar with, because in chapters 2 and 3, we read a message from Jesus to churches in those days. Now, you can see in verse number 4 of chapter 1 that John is actually writing to what he calls the 7 churches which are in Asia. If you go down to verse 11, he identifies those 7 churches, which are Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. There's been a debate, and this is part of what makes studying Revelation sometimes confusing. There are many people who would say that they believe that these churches are kind of like prophecy regarding the church over time. So a lot of people don't even think that these were literal congregations so as much as they were just, this was a way of writing, and it represented how this should be interpreted and show how the church was going to deal with things over time. And so that's more of a futuristic way of interpreting Revelation. But since in chapter 1 and verse 1, it says that these things should shortly take place, I think the much more preferred way to look at these 7 churches is that these were actually 7 churches. These were 7 real churches that existed in those days in Asia Minor. And so therefore, these are real people, real churches, real events, and Jesus is knowing about them, and he's watching out over these churches. And one of the things that I think is true about this is that Jesus is, someone has said he's checking in with them. He's checking in with these churches because remember, they are under and they're about to go through a very difficult time in this awful persecution that's being led by Domitian and that would follow for years and years and years. And so Jesus he's wanting to make sure that these churches are ready for this and that they're going to be faithful and they're going to be able to persevere through this. Now, we don't have the time to go through each one of them, obviously. There's 2 whole chapters here. He devotes what we would call a few verses to each church. But I would think that it would be good to see that each one of these, there are 3 things true of each one of these churches that Jesus speaks to. Number 1, there's an exclamation about Jesus. He says something about himself to them. He describes himself in some kind of way to them as he addresses them. Number 2, there's an examination of their faithfulness. And that's probably the thing that sticks out the most to us. There is something personal being said about each one of these churches. Only 2 of these churches, the one at Smyrna and the one at Philadelphia, received no censure. In other words, Jesus didn't say anything bad to them or bad about them. He didn't rebuke them in any kind of way. One of the churches, Laodicea, that's all he said. That's all he had to say to them. He just rebuked them. He didn't say one positive thing about them. But all the others, though, basically had some kind of strength and some kind of weakness, if you will. And so then the third thing you'll see in each one of these, he gives some encouragement to them. He gives encouragement to everyone. Even the ones that were doing well, he encourages them. Even the ones that weren't doing well, like Laodicea, he encourages them. But for all of these churches, he encourages them because he knows that they are going through some very difficult times. And he wants them to be ready. He wants them to stand for him. And so you can see Jesus here in Revelation watching out for the church, addressing the church, being concerned and compassionate, and if need be, rebuking of the church. And I would say to you today that Jesus is still concerned about the church, obviously. This church, Waterview Church of Christ, is a local congregation just like these 7 churches, just like them. The church meets in different places, and God knows where the church meets. And just as he's concerned about and was concerned about them, he is concerned about us. Let's never forget that. Jesus is still watching. He's still concerned. He knows us. He knows the things that we do well. He knows the things that we need to do better. Jesus is watching, and he's concerned about the church. The next thing I want you to see about Jesus in Revelation, this will be number 7. Jesus is judge in Revelation. Jesus is judge. Now, let's go over a little bit in Revelation to chapter 14. Let's look at some verses in Revelation chapter 14. Let's start reading about verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel, having to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, "Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water." And another angel follows, saying, "Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." And then a third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast and his image, and receives his mark on their forehead or on his hand, he himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation. He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. And they have no rest day or night who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name." People have sometimes asked this question: is the Jesus in Revelation the same Jesus that you read about in the gospel? I don't know if you've ever thought that yourself when you read through Revelation and or when you've considered what the gospels say about Jesus. Another way of asking that question is the gospel Jesus the Revelation Jesus, or is the Revelation Jesus the gospel Jesus? Or still another way to ask this, is the Revelation Jesus the real Jesus? That's what people want to know. And I'll tell you the answer to this question. The answer to this question is it's the same Jesus. And you knew I was going to say that. It's the same Jesus. When you look at Jesus described in Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13, Luke chapter 21, you know what you find? You find a judging Jesus. You find a Jesus who's fierce and who is going to judge. He's coming in the glory of his Father. There's a great judgment happening between the sheep and the goats are going to be sent into eternal punishment. And so while there might not seem to be as much said in the gospel accounts about Jesus being judge and fierce, it's still there. It might be abbreviated in the gospels, but it's there. It's dreadful. Eternal is eternal. Punishment is punishment. And it might surprise you to learn that Jesus speaks more of anybody else in the Bible about hell than anyone else. He's the one who brings it up the very most. And he says more in the Bible about hell and using this imagery like unquenchable flames and outer darkness, and their worm does not die, or weeping and gnashing of teeth. And you know where he says all of that? He says all of that in what we call the gospel. These are in the Gospels. Jesus describing what will be for those who do not obey his Son. And so the Jesus of the Gospels is the one who speaks vividly and powerfully about hell. And the Jesus of Revelation is the one who at the end says the Spirit and the bride say, "Come." Let him who hears come. You can read about the fierceness of Jesus, if you will, in the Gospels. But you also can read about the compassion of Jesus in the book of Revelation. And then just like in the Gospels, Jesus is presented in Revelation as the Christ who died for us, who loves us and covers our sin. We saw that last week in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 5. He is said to be the one who provides robes that make us white because they've been washed in his blood. And so I think it's even accurate to say the information, as we discussed just a moment ago in chapters 2 and 3 about the churches, Jesus is even judging the churches there. Jesus is judge in Revelation, but he also is judge in the Gospels. And so, yes, Jesus is the same in Revelation as you read about him anywhere else in the Bible. It's not two different Jesuses. And Revelation reminds us that he is going to be judge. And there's much more we could say about that. One other thing real quickly, and that is Jesus is also victorious in Revelation. This is something you already knew, and it's what I want to close with. Jesus is victorious in Revelation. In chapter 19 and chapter 14, you can see at the conclusion of this vision, Jesus is the King of Kings, he's the Lord of Lords, and he is riding triumphantly on a white horse as a symbol of his conquest. Jesus is going to overcome. And sometimes it looks like it's going to take a while. Remember, I said a moment ago, 300 years this war against the church took place as it was against the people of God, and it was fought by Rome, the Roman Empire. And all the while, this information was being read by the Christians, and they might have thought, when is it ever going to happen? When is Jesus ever going to judge Rome? When is Jesus ever going to come and give us the victory? I would remind you that when Jesus makes a promise, it is going to happen. If Jesus says he's going to be victorious, it will happen. It might seem like it's not happening immediately, and maybe there's something going on in your life right now, and you just wish Jesus would give you the victory, or that Jesus would judge someone that's harassing you in your life. But what he wants you to do in the meantime is just be faithful and to remember that he is going to give you the victory. He's going to be victorious. And because you are his, you're going to be victorious. Let me tell you this one story to put Revelation maybe in its proper perspective. In the 4th century, this would have been toward the end of that 300-year war. Rome was at that time being ruled by the pagan emperor Julian. And Julian had ordered all the churches of the Nazarene, as he called them, the Church of Jesus Christ. He had ordered them closed. Any church associated with Jesus, he had ordered them closed. And all the churches that were pagan churches that had closed down, he ordered them to open back up. And it said that en route to fight the Persians, he camped for some months near Antioch of Syria to train his army. And while he was there, he heard of an old boyhood friend of his who lived there in Syria, or Antioch rather. And he wanted to check up on him and see how he was. So one day, the emperor put on a plain man's clothes, and he went down into the city, and he looked up his friend, and he talked to him for a while. And they visited, and of course, he also knew that his friend had become a Christian, and he wanted to ask him about Christianity. And so while they were visiting, after they talked for just a little while, He looked sarcastically at his Christian friend, and the emperor said, "Hey, what is the carpenter of Nazareth doing these days?" And his friend, the Christian, looked at him in the eye and said, "Do you really want to know?" And again, sarcastically, the emperor said, "Yes, I want to know." And his Christian friend said, "He is building a coffin in which to bury your empire." He knew the message of Revelation. He knew that at some point, Jesus was going to be victorious and that he would win. We don't have the time to read in Revelation chapter 21 about how we'll win as well, and how we'll have the victory, and how all of our tears, all the frustration will be wiped away. What you need to know as we close this lesson is that not only is Jesus victorious in Revelation, and he overcomes in Revelation, his people do too. And if Jesus wins, we win. And because Jesus wins, we will win. And I hope that you are in Jesus. If you're not his, if you're not a child of his, we'd like to end this lesson by giving you an opportunity to become one. Or if you are discouraged and need our prayers, why don't you come right now as we stand and as we sing.